So with every Gatsby project, because Gatsby rolls with GraphQL by default as its query language, you're able to actually access a GraphQL playground by going to localhost 8000 ___ GraphQL. This will load up this playground that shows us all of the queries we're able to make inside of GraphQL. Now, this is really good because we're actually able to do a lot of different things with this GraphQL query list. For example, by default, we're actually able to access every single file inside of our directory. Now, when I say this, what do I mean? So if you look inside of your Gatsby config, you'll see that there's this plugin here called Gatsby Source File System. Now, Gatsby Source File System is a way for you to actually access the nodes that represent the files inside of this directory. With the name and the path, the name just essentially allows us to tell Gatsby what it is that we want to put this under when we query for it. Now, what are we querying for is actually going to be any files that lives inside this path that we provided. So here we see that we're string interpolating this directory name, which pretty much just represents whatever the final directory structure is. And I want to go into our source folder and then our images folder. So right here. Now it's named images because what it's trying to do is get all of the image files. Now, if we go back to our GraphQL, we'll see that what it is that we got is actually this thing called all file. Now, inside of this Explorer, you'll see this list of all the different queries that we can access. So if we wanted to actually see what that plugin was giving us, if I do all file and I hit Command Enter or Control Enter if you're on a Windows, you'll see that it automatically populates with these properties of edges, node, and then the ID. Now, edges represent the actual path to that file that we're pointing to. So meaning that edges will be the array of the number of files that we have inside of our images folder. Now, inside of every edge will be a node, and that node is the representation of what that file is. Now, the node Gatsby will convert for us. But what that means is that if we look inside of this list, we'll be able to see what properties we're actually able to pluck off and look at. So if we do absolute path, and if we do relative path as well, if we hit enter again, we'll see that we're pointing to each of our image files. And now, by using this query, we're actually able to get all of the files that we want inside of our project. So if we wanted to, for example, store different data inside of these files in order to actually represent our blogs, we're able to do so using this all file query. Now, we're definitely going to explore that because this is really how it is that we're going to build out our blogs. There is a couple things that we have to make sure that we do first, though. One thing is that while we're able to see a representation of our files, we cannot actually get the data in those files yet. In order to do so, we have to make some modifications to Gatsby. And what we're going to write is going to be a little bit different than anything else you've probably ever written before. Now, what we want to do is we want to start actually building our blogs. There's a couple things that we have to do in order to set this up. The first is that we have to write the files that will hold the data of our blogs to begin with. So these could just be individual blog posts with some text in them. Now, the way that we can actually build out the blog content and get access to all of the styling is to use something called Markdown. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Markdown, Markdown is what is used to build many of the READMEs that you see inside of GitHub. So you'll see that we have access to these different titles. We got access to the static linking. We can put all of these images inside. And we also get access to these code blocks inside of Markdown. So Markdown is a pretty consistently structured and very supported style of writing text that Gatsby also allows us to use. So if we wanted to write our blogs and get styling, you really just need to learn a little bit of Markdown. And I will give you a Markdown cheat sheet that tells you all of the different styles you can apply in Markdown when you start writing your blogs. But I have some pre-written. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a new folder that is going to hold all of our Markdown files that represent the blogs we're about to make. So go back to your application. And what you're going to do is make a new file inside of your source, a new folder, and we're going to call it Markdown Pages. Inside of Markdown Pages is going to be each Markdown file that represents each blog post you're going to write. So I'm going to make a new one, and I'm going to call it Ice Cream. And I'm going to call it icecream.md. Now, .md stands for Markdown. Now, inside of this, I'm just going to paste my Markdown code that represents the first blog that I'm writing. And I am also going to give you this resource as well, just so that you can walk through with me before you actually make your own Markdown files. Now, you'll notice at the top here, there are these 3 dashes. These 3 dashes represent what's called the front matter. And the front matter is just kind of like some data that you can pull off of this Markdown file and have it represent perhaps some data that you want to display inside of a snippet rather than the entire content of the actual blog itself. This can also hold any metadata. So you can just see the front matter as metadata, and we're going to explore how to actually use it inside of our GraphQL queries. So other than this one, I actually also have another Markdown file that I want to make, and I want to call it myfirstama.md. And similarly, I have the other file here for you. And here you'll see that I'm embedding an iframe. Now this iframe points to a YouTube link of the first AMA that I did a couple weeks ago. But this thing is actually going to be what you get from YouTube as an embed link. So you can put this inside of Markdown as well, because Markdown ends up being compiled to HTML. And that's another great thing about using Markdown, is that using these 2 Markdown files, we're now able to represent our blogs very dynamically. Because if we wanted to write new blogs, we simply just add new Markdown files that represent our blogs. And then after we write the remaining code that will dynamically build out our blog posts, we'll be pretty set in terms of our blog website. Now, the one thing that we do have to do is we have to make sure that we're actually able to access these Markdown files. Because as you remember inside of our config, right now, all we're doing with this file system is simply accessing images. If we wanted access to Markdown, we can just duplicate this block of code here, so copy paste it down, except I'm going to change this name over to Markdowns, and instead of the path pointed to images, I'm going to point to our new Markdown Pages path. So let's save this, and what you have to do is you actually have to restart your server whenever you change any plugins inside of your config. So while we get hot reloading with a lot of the metadata or any of the files that we change inside of our general structure, we do not get it with our config plugins. If you change the plugin, just restart your server. And once it's finished building, we're going to go back to our GraphQL and we're going to take a look at what it is that we get. So if we refresh now and we hit enter, we still see our original image files, but now we see that we also have our Markdown files. So now that we're able to access the node representation of these Markdown files, let's actually figure out how to pull the data out of them in order to dynamically build out the pages that we need inside of our application to represent these blog posts. And that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. So I'll see you in that lesson.